Let's take a look at the White House and the presidency. Big differences between presidents and prime ministers. Twice as many parliaments in the world among world's democracies. Prime minister is chosen by the legislature. President is chosen by the people. Members of parliament become cabinet ministers. Congress members cannot hold executive office and remain in Congress under the Constitution. Prime Minister remains in power as long as his or her party remains majority party of Parliament. President stands for election every 4 years and can only serve for 8 years. Prime Ministers are always insiders within the Parliament. Presidents are more often from outside the DC Beltway. Prime Ministers always enjoy a majority of their party in Parliament. Presidents more often put up with divided government, a necessary byproduct of representative democracy. Matter of fact, 21 of the last 28 elections since 1952 have produced gridlock, and the president is a different party than Congress. The evolution of the presidency, the founders looked at, they felt that the legislature would be the supreme branch of the government. President, they thought about a plural executive having more than 2 executives. That was Madison's plan. An executive checked by a consul. That became Hamilton's plan in the convention. Neither one of them went through, but the question was always about a commander-in-chief. As the head of the military, would this person overpower the states? Would the president corrupt the Senate, since the Senate at the time strictly represented the states? Would there be bribery involved? The result, taking the choice for president out of the hands of the people, taking it away from the aristocracy, it came up with the Electoral College, which we've studied at length. President's term of office, Washington's precedent, George Washington refused the third term. He could have served for life if he had chosen to. That became the precedent for many years until Franklin Roosevelt, elected in 32, 36, 40, and 44. As a result, when the Republicans took over, the 22nd Amendment was passed that limits the president to 2 terms or a total of 10 years. As we've had orderly transfer of power between presidents since the inception of the United States government. Early presidents were Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. The early founders, the leaders of the nation, established the legitimacy of the presidency. Minimal activism of early government quelled fears of a strong president. Cabinet members had stature under the early presidents. There are very few vetoes that happened for the first 50 years. Andrew Jackson changed all that because of the corrupt bargain of the 1824 election. When Jackson was elected on his own in 1828, he challenged Congress. Jackson was known as King Veto. He vetoed laws principally on his attitude and his feelings rather than whether or not they were constitutional. Except for brief periods of exceptional presidents, the period from 1836 to 1932 was dominated by Congress. The exceptions, of course, were Lincoln, with the Civil War showed the implied powers of the president as commander-in-chief. Teddy Roosevelt diminished the presence of party and appealed to the public with his candidacy as a progressive. Woodrow Wilson demonstrated the power of idealism during World War I. But since Franklin Roosevelt and the Great Depression and World War II, resulting periods during the Cold War, regional wars, and the economy have solidified the position of president as head of the government. And Congress has taken a back seat. Regardless of party politics, president oftentimes is at cross purposes with Congress because the president is in charge of foreign policy and the domestic budget. Powers of the president. It's often looked at that The presidency is a position with sparse constitutional direction. There really isn't a whole lot in Article 2. The great source of the power lies in politics and public opinion. If the president can get public opinion behind him or her, then they have power. Different hats that the president wears: chief executive, in charge of the executive branch of the government; as commander in chief, as civilian military leader; as head of state, the ceremonial head of state, in meeting foreign leaders, and as representative of the United States government, the person who's behind the podium and can show his or her face to the world; as party leader, the president is the acknowledged leader of his or her party; and of course, since World War II, as leader of the free world. The West Wing of the White House, where most of the work happens. You can, as a president, you can organize the West Wing as circular, with you in the middle and your staff members outside on the circle, and they report to you. You can try, doesn't happen very often. Probably the last time we would have seen a top-down management style would have been Richard Nixon, with the president at the top and everybody below him in his administration. Oftentimes what you have now are ad hoc groups of different groups within the cabinet that work together and ignore other members of the cabinet and give advice to the president. Staff typically in the West Wing were campaign chiefs. Some were experts in their field, but more than often they managed to help the president get elected. And the West Wing staff oftentimes is much more important than the cabinet. The president oftentimes sets up his cabinet secretaries, and as long as they don't bother him, he won't bother them. But the chief of staff for the West Wing is the gatekeeper. No one gets to the president without going through the chief of staff. Chief of staff is much more important than the vice president. The executive office of the president is composed of those agencies which report directly to the president. Those appointees must receive confirmation of the Senate. Most important branch of the executive office of the president, Office of Management and Budget, because the president gives his or her budget to Congress, which they debate. The Office of Management and Budget assembles the budget, develops reorganization plans for the budget, and reviews legislative proposals that go to Congress regarding the budget. Congress always debates the budget given to them by the White House. The cabinet is largely a fiction. There's no mention in the Constitution of advisors to the president. Of course, we've had the first with Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of State and Secretary. There was only 3 cabinet members under Washington, but secretaries now, there are 14 of them, become preoccupied and often defensive about their entrenched positions. As I said, oftentimes they're not going to report directly to the president. They're going to do their job until somebody decides they're not doing their job. You have independent agencies and commissions within the executive office. Presidential appointees are quasi-independent. They can only be removed for cause before their fixed term expires. Examples of the Federal Reserve Board and the Securities and Exchange Commission, created during the Great Depression. Presidential appointees to the federal judgeships must be approved by the Senate. They serve for life and can be removed only by impeachment. So who gets appointed? The president knows a few appointees outside the West Wing personally. Most appointees have had federal experience. They're in and outers within Washington. They need to consider important interest groups when making appointments along gender lines, along interest group lines, along minority lines. There's oftentimes a rivalry between department heads and White House staff.